So I've talked about the legends connected with specific characters from either history or myth. Let's now talk about the folk customs and folk traditions. There are lots of folk traditions, or there have been lots of folk traditions in Britain, although many of them, especially in England and central England, went out of use after the Industrial Revolution, with the unification of the country by the railways, with the industrialization, with the urbanization. Local folk customs connected to small areas, to sometimes individual villages, quickly went out of use. Later, towards the end of the 19th century and also in the 20th century, there were many people who wanted to preserve them or even to reconstruct them. So now we sometimes have those customs and legends and folk stories, but they are perhaps not as widespread as they were before the 18th, 19th century. So here we have some examples of the folk beliefs and folk customs. The oldest ones, and here we have some examples from either Somerset or Cornwall or Cumbria. So if you remember, the traditionally Celtic lands that are connected with the prehistoric standing stones. Of course, they have been there forever, so for as long as human memory could go back, but the real cultural significance of these stone circles and standing stones was forgotten over the centuries, and later on in the Middle Ages and later, people were just making legends and stories, trying to explain what happened and why they had those strange stones standing in a circle in their local village or a meadow somewhere near the village. Usually the ideas that these stone constructions brought to the minds of the people was the rings of dancers, the people dancing in the circle. So sometimes these would be merrymakers, young people dancing, or a wedding party that were punished for something. Either they committed some crime, some trespass against God's law, like they danced on a day of fasting, perhaps, and they were punished by it, or they inadvertently hired devils as their musicians or something like that. So they committed some sort of trespass, and consequently, as punishment, they were turned to stone. So here we have one of such places, the so-called Dancers of Stanton Drew in Somerset, and also we have similar stories, similar folk traditions connected with other prehistoric stone circles like Long Meg and her daughters in Cumbria, or the Merry Maidens in Cornwall. So usually this would be like local people dancing, a wedding party, perhaps some young girls dancing and punished. Then we have all kinds of folk creatures, folk legendary creatures that are perhaps connected with some places, but also you can find them in decorations in churches even sometimes, or castles, and they all go back to the folk traditions, to the pagan religions, going back to Celtic times and even earlier. One of such creatures, one of such characters from folk mythology is the Green Man. So Some versions have him being a kind of spirit of the forest, a kind of deity of plants and fertility and the woods. One quite famous version is Herne the Hunter, from Berkshire, mostly connected to the area of Windsor Park. If you watch the old 1980s version of BBC TV series about Robin Hood, he is quite important there, and this is the version of Robin Hood that links the stories of the robbers with Herne the Hunter and pagan mythology. So you may remember this. This is perhaps my favorite version of Robin Hood's story. But anyway, in many places in England, sometimes even in churches, like here we have this decorative image from Norwich Cathedral, or names of pubs. So here we have a pub called the Green Man, with the image of the Green Man. We have this human form or a face of a man covered with leaves and greenery. Possibly going back to Celtic religion. We have some customs that survive in local areas, mostly through those 19th century or early 20th century reconstructions. They are connected with the year cycle. So for example, you have May Day celebrations with the maypole dancing, and also legendary mythological creatures alluding to the spirits of nature, to the spirits of the forest. So Jack in the Green, a version of the Green Man really, or the May Queen, a beautiful young goddess of spring and fertility. We have also lots of mythological spooky creatures like elves, pixies, goblins, household spirits. Some of them you may recall from Shakespeare, like Puck, also called Robin Goodfellow from the Midsummer Night's Dream. Some of them made their way to children's fairy tales or even to fantasy fiction. They are all based on folklore, on English folklore, if you think about that. Then we have the witches, the sorcerers, the people who make magic, either black magic to do harm to their neighbors, or white magic to help them, to heal them. Usually, of course, the black magicians and the witches, the bad witches, are more interesting for the folklore. Some of them are connected with specific places in the geography. The most famous one was called Mother Shipton, and she is the figure from Yorkshire folklore. So there are some places connected with this famous witch. But if you look at the list here, there are quite a lot of places connected with the stories of witches and wizards and sorcerers. Unfortunately, also with the witch trials, like the famous or infamous Pendle witches in Lancashire, who were women accused of witchcraft, really, and tried, and many of them were executed. So this is the way when folklore and folk beliefs really gave rise to real persecution of real people. Another version, another category is dwarfs and giants. So mythological creatures or folk creatures who are either very large or very small. Again, quite a few places with the names of those giants, mostly giants, but sometimes sometimes you have the stories of the dwarfs as well, like the story of Tom Thumb, which is a fairy tale but based on folk beliefs, English folk beliefs. We have also a very interesting, I guess, medieval illumination showing a giant building Stonehenge. So some people actually believed that this was how Stonehenge was built. Some of you may remember our discussions of the Giant's Causeway in Northern Ireland, and also Fingal's Cave in Scotland, so the other side of the sea. And this is perhaps the most famous story, folk story connected with the belief in giants. Here we have a children's book telling an Irish legend or fairy tale of a giant called Finn McCool, and how he built the causeway to get either to another giant and fight with him, or perhaps to a lady giant he noticed from across the sea and fell in love with. So there are different versions of this story, but the basic idea is that unexplained natural phenomena like the stones of Giant's Causeway, or mysterious human creations like Stonehenge, were sometimes attributed to the work of the giants. Another story or another type of creatures were wild men or sea men, mermaids as well. So creatures that were similar to humans in their intelligence, but they lived in the sea or they lived somewhere in the wild. And especially the seamen were quite popular. So what we have here is a story from Suffolk, the town of Orford. Here we have Orford Castle, and the local legend retelling how local fisherman caught a wild man. Here we have him on a sign of a local pub. So apparently he was like a male mermaid, a merman. He was caught, and they took him to the castle. They tried to interrogate him. They couldn't really communicate with him, and given the first opportunity, he escaped back to the sea. So there we go. Then we have mythical beasts, mythical animals. So this was probably a missing link between animals and people. Now let's talk about mythical animals. So first and foremost, the dragons. England is the land of the dragons. Scotland as well. Wales even has the dragon in their flag. So the Cadwallader of Wales. So we have the story of St. George defeating a dragon, and lots of local stories of dragons or some other creatures like the wyverns and the worms, and these basically mean different kinds of dragons. Some that can fly, some that swim in the water, some that are very large, or smaller ones that just catch the livestock of people. And as you can see, quite a lot of places in Britain have local legends concerning dragons, concerning the dragons being defeated by local knights or heroes or crafty village lads, or even stories of some maidens befriending dragons and kind of having them as pets. So all kinds of stories with the dragons. Perhaps the most famous of these dragons would be the Loch Ness Monster from Scotland. Here we have the location of the lake of Loch Ness, and some images, including the allegedly real photograph showing the head of Loch Ness Monster taken in 1834. It was a fabrication, but it really spurred the legend, and there have been all kinds of stories, and it's still a very popular place for tourists who, some of them, hope to catch the glimpse of Nessie. Some more beasts, very popular type of legendary folk beast is the black dog, or giant dogs. The dogs that are threatening and very large, and sometimes their eyes glisten in the dark. So we have lots of places, as you can see here, telling the stories, the scary stories of black dogs. They could be connected with the devil, they could be supernatural, or just mysterious, large, threatening animals. Of course, they made way to literature. If you remember the story by Arthur Conan Doyle, The Hound of the Baskervilles, with Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson, dealing with the mysterious hound somewhere in Dorset. So of course the areas, the mythical southwest of England, being connected with all kinds of folk beliefs. There is also a more real connection with the black dog, going all the way at least to the 18th century, to the writings of a great intellectual and diarist and writer, Dr. Johnson, who referred to the concept of the black dog to mean depression. He suffered from occasional bouts of depression, and he nicknamed his episodes of depression the black dog. The same wording was used later by Winston Churchill, who also occasionally suffered from depression. So here we have a very interesting modern book, a little book. You can Google it, Living with a Black Dog. It's not of course a real black dog, but living with depression, using this old English folk belief. It's not only dogs though, there are also other legendary beasts, mostly large cats, wild large cats. So the beasts of Bodmin Moor in Cornwall, and some more beasts. One of them is even called the King of the Cats. They are similar stories with large predatory animals allegedly living in England, and here we have again a photograph which is supposed to show one of these animals. It looks like a black panther. Maybe somebody had a black panther and it's run away. Then we have other beasts like the kelpies in Scotland. So seahorses, but very large and threatening and dangerous, and here we have an image of a kelpie, the artistic rendition. A few more things about folk customs and folk traditions that still somehow survive. So some of them are connected with the harvest. Especially in Derbyshire, we have the decoration of wells in flowers and grains, and making little corn dollies, which were traditional ways of celebrating the harvest, going back to pagan religions again. We have a tradition of love spoons in Wales, so traditional gifts, handmade gifts, usually exchanged among people who are in love, with a practical side to it, a little spoon, but then carved symbolism referring to love, marriage, faithfulness, and other positive things. We have quite a lot of folk dances still surviving, not perhaps as popular as they used to be, but as you can see, There are some examples. The most popular form is called Morris dancing. Here you have a group of men dressed in those quite characteristic white costumes with little bells attached to their legs, so when they jump, when they dance, the bells make a noise. Sometimes they dance with staves, which are like kind of sticks. Sometimes even they dance with swords. One of the traditional ways of doing those dances is called Molly dancing, in which basically it's kind of cross-dressing. Men dress as women, women dress as men. It's kind of folk humor with a lot of dressing up. Two moments in the year, except for May Day, that are quite connected to all these folk customs, and if you ever are in Britain around that time, you can find something interesting to watch. One or even three. So Christmas and Easter and the 5th of November. So Christmas and Easter are of course Christian celebrations, but the traditions go further back in history. So what we have are sometimes parades, local parades in villages with people dressing up and sometimes also presenting some sort of folk creatures from folk beliefs, like this straw bear in Cambridgeshire. We have all kinds of dressing up games and plays called the Mummers Play or Pace Egg Play around Christmas and Easter respectively. And on the 5th of November there is the bonfire night, connected with the historical event of the thwarted gunpowder plot, when the group of Catholic fighters, terrorists, tried to blow up the Houses of Parliament with King James I in attendance. So what happens is figures, straw figures called guys, after Guy Fawkes, the leader of this group, are made, and they are either burnt at bonfires or paraded, and there are fireworks at night. So basically, this is a kind of patriotic celebration, but with a lot of folk elements to it. So there we go. That's the folk culture of Britain. We can talk about it a bit more during the live meeting, and now I'd like to pass to the places connected with famous writers.